Hello, fellow classmates. Today you will get a quick insight in the 50s and 60s most popular hits in music. Stay tuned.
In the beginning, the 50s consisted of innocent music. Classical music was still very popular, but that would soon change when artists would start to put melodies in their records. Music had just begun and was showing signs of changing, and that is exactly what it did. Instruments like saxophones, drums, and guitars were commonly seen in the industry. People were becoming more and more expressive with their music. If anything, it was changing for the better. Music started to differ due to many social issues. The music that was released contained a lot of anger and remorse that the artists expressed during the separate but equal era. Rocking for civil rights would become a phrase later on for those who would voice their thoughts in the industry. During this decade, a large group of children who would later become known as baby boomers became young teenagers. During that point in history, that was the largest generation. These teenagers would start the phrase teenage rebellion. Teenage rebellion would become the reason behind the popularity of certain music genres such as rock and roll, blues, and R&B. Rock and roll became popular during the 50s. This style of music was drawn from African American blues music. Rock and roll would become popular and played everywhere. Artists like Elvis Presley would later become known as the king of rock and roll. Although Elvis Presley did not create rock and roll, he did, however, popularize it and was one of the few artists who credited black artists. Elvis Presley began attracting attention with his music in 1954. He was very distinctive with his style, which included black rhythm and blues songs. In 1956, Elvis Presley performed the very controversial song Hound Dog. Hound Dog was originally by Big Mama, but Elvis Presley would make it one of the most famous songs in music history. A year later, Jailhouse Rock would be released. Jailhouse Rock would be a #1 hit in U.S. pop charts for 7 weeks. It would also be #1 in the country for R&B. Chuck Berry was also known as one of the pioneers of music and was one of the few black artists that would become popular during the era of segregation. Chuck Berry was self-taught when it came to instruments and attracted all demographics. In 1958, Chuck Berry released the song Johnny B. Good. Although Chuck Berry wasn't titled the King of Rock, he sure knew how to perfect it, and in this song his talent was shown. The song in total had 5 instruments: guitar, bass, piano, drums, and vocal. The song was about how much money a musician can make just by playing the guitar. Chuck Berry also released other songs like Roll Over Beethoven that was directed to the uptight people in the 50s that did not take rock and roll seriously. The song would also be covered by the Beatles later on. In 1957, Ray Charles releases the song I Got a Woman. This song would be seen as taboo and wasn't played in many radio stations. The song would also later on be used by Kanye West in his song Gold Digger. Blues was music that originated deep in the South. It was known as spiritual music for African Americans and folk music for white Americans. A lot of it had hoots, shouts, or chants. Blues had a lot of jazz, rock and roll, and sometimes consisted of repetitive noise. Pasty Kleins is a well-known artist with Walking After Midnight as a big hit.
Throughout this portion of our video, you will encounter many popular artists and groups from the 1960s, such as the Jackson 5, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Supremes, and solo artists like Stevie Wonder and Ben E. King. The Jackson 5 was a group of 5 brothers who decided to introduce genres such as pop, blues, soul, disco, and funk music into the 1960s. They originated in 1964 and later dropped an album with Diana Ross under Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5, which incorporated a very popular song of theirs, I Want You Back. This group was unique because during this time it wasn't as common for an African American band to succeed because of discrimination towards Black and African American people. Luckily, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited states to segregate Black people from whites. Now we move on to a very well-known band, the Beatles. The Beatles was a four-man group that began in 1960 that incorporated rock and pop in their music. Their song, Here Comes the Sun, was released in 1969 and is still being listened to and even produced in movies such as The Bee Movie. The purpose of this song was to create a catchy tune during this time. Many people seem to interpret this song and view it as a song for hope while Vietnam veterans were at war. Yes, the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones was a five-man band created in 1962, formed in London. Their genre of music was rock and roll, more specifically English rock. The song Satisfaction was released in 1965, just after the baby booming finished in 1964. The Supremes was a female group created in 1959. They later dropped a common hit, You Can't Hurry Love, in 1966. Their music was very soul, disco, and blues inspired. Because of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, they were allowed to perform for both white and black audiences. Stevie Wonder was a solo artist, singer, and songwriter in the 1960s. He stood out from many artists because he was blind. He was commonly known for his famous Christmas jingles like Someday at Christmas, which was released in 1967. His Christmas album was inspired by many common Christmas jingles that originated from white artists. Ben E. King was an African-American soul, R&B, pop music artist in the 1960s. His most famous hit, Stand By Me, in 1962 was a soulful song. He wrote this song with purpose to bring people together because of the segregation between black and white people. The 1960s was a mixture of pop, rock, and soulful music. Each artist in this presentation portrays each genre in their own style, making it their very own. Many of these artists were inspired by current events occurring in the 1960s, such as the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the baby boom, protests, etc., that influenced these artists and the music they would produce. To this day, these artists are still recognized for their memorable music. Some have passed, while others have created their own solo journey, leaving their band. All these artists have impacted the 1960s with new music, leading us to the future music industry. The roots of rock emerged in the 1960s. Pop rock, folk music, blues, and country rock were all different types of genres that were brought into this era. A popular instrument used in the 1960s was a guitar. The guitar played a huge impact on these genres of music.